This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 802 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's transactions, remember to check out the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. When you're a patron, you get access to multiple live stream Q&As with me each week. You get weekly rankings, rest of season rankings and tiers, and more. You can learn more about it over on lateround.com. Now let's get to these transactions. Hold DeAndre Swift. So with this 15 transactions list each week, I don't have conviction about every single transaction I'm talking about. Sometimes I just have to talk about the big storylines. And one of the big storylines right now has to do with DeAndre Swift. So I'm sure if I didn't talk about DeAndre Swift, a lot of you would be coming at me saying, what's your take on Swift? So let's get to it. DeAndre Swift's a very polarizing player. After that game this past week, I sent an objective tweet about his workload against Minnesota. And the response to that tweet was very divided. One group was really excited about his 27-point performance. The other group was skeptical. Now, it's easy to understand the anti-DeAndre Swift movement. He's burned a lot of fantasy managers in the past. He's had a hard time staying healthy. And you have to wonder why Detroit did what they did with him. That's why recommending one direction or the other is tough for a player like Swift. Here's the thing, though. The team with Swift in your league probably is not in a hurry to sell. They drafted him because they liked him as a player. They probably like him even more now. And in the leagues where I personally have him, the only way that I'd trade him away right now is if there's a one-sided offer sitting on the table. Because there's a lot of baggage with DeAndre Swift. And that brings down his trade value. Now, against Minnesota in week 2, he ended up seeing about 78% of the team's running back rushes and a 13.6% target share. For some context, Miles Sanders last season with Philadelphia, he hit a 70% running back rush share and a 10% target share just once, in just one game. And no, it's not because Philadelphia runs some unique backfield committee. Guys, almost every backfield in the NFL is a committee at this point. What Philadelphia does with their running backs, not necessarily super unique. In fact, last season, Miles Sanders had the 6th highest running back rush share per game rate in all of football. He was 17th in snap share. The Eagles' backfield really wasn't any more of a committee than another random backfield in the league. The Eagles' backfield was just more mediocre in fantasy because, number one, Jalen Hurts was stealing some goal line work and he was scoring touchdowns. And number two, they didn't target running backs out of the backfield that much. Those are the two big questions with DeAndre Swift still. That's what scares me the most moving forward. To me, if you want to look at this as a committee, I think DeAndre Swift and what he did in week 2, he's now the 1A in that backfield. He's above Kenneth Gainwell. I understand Gainwell was hurt, but sometimes this happens. A good performance can knock off an injured player. You can't put a 175-yard rushing performance back in the garage on a competitive team. And it's not like Swift saw 100% of the team's running back rushes. He can be in that 60 to 80% range moving forward, allowing Gainwell to still get some run. But again, will that 13.6% target share maintain? Will Jalen Hurts stop scoring so many goal line touchdowns? Those are big question marks for Swift. And that's why Swift probably doesn't have a top 10 ceiling rest of season as a result. Just last season, Miles Sanders scored 11 times on the ground. He was the RB22 in PPR points per game with 11 touchdowns. Now, Swift is a more dynamic player and pass catcher. But that just goes to show how this situation isn't necessarily ideal. This is what happens when you have an effective mobile quarterback. Now, with all that being said, I don't think anyone's expecting DeAndre Swift to be a top 10 back rest of season. If someone's trying to sell him that way, then no, you should not be buying him that way. To me, he's looking like a solid RB2. So you just have to ask yourself, does the Swift manager in your league, does the Swift manager see it that way? Or does the Swift manager truly think that he's an RB1? Because I would be selling the idea of him being an RB1. I would be buying the idea of him being a solid RB2. And if you have Swift on your roster, unless you're getting a really, really good deal, I'd probably just hold him. That's at least what I'm doing. Add Zach Moss. So I think it's important to recognize that all of the content that I produce sort of works off of one another. Before week 1, Roschon Johnson, he was an ad within this 15 transactions list. Then he had a good performance that week, but there wasn't any need for me to recommend him in week 2 because I had already recommended him in week 1. Now, every now and again, I'm going to re-emphasize a certain point, but I'm not going to repeat transactions because I want to give you as much relevant information as I possibly can. Meanwhile, Zach Moss, he wasn't featured on last week's 15 transaction show, but he was featured on the sleeper show. So hopefully you were still able to get him and get something out of him in week 2. And yeah, I know that it sounds like I'm backpatting right now, so I'll just say this. I said that Mike Evans was a sell last week. Your boy takes plenty of L's too. But let's talk about Zach Moss. In week 2, he didn't just see every single running back carry for Indianapolis. He saw every single running back snap. That is not normal. That's not normal usage. But that's what happens when you have as bad of a performance as Deion Jackson had in week 1. That led to 20.7 PPR points. Zach Moss was an RB1 in week 2. Now, I think we all expect Jonathan Taylor to be back at some point, I guess. But even still, Moss needs to be rostered everywhere given his usage in week 2. Sell Jordan Love. Now, I totally understand if you can't trade away quarterbacks in your league, but I do feel this need to talk about Jordan Love and his start. Through Sunday night's game, Love is fantasy football's QB2. Only Kirk Cousins has scored more standard points than Jordan freaking Love. The problem is the underlying metrics for Love are not nearly as good. According to Next Gen Stats, only Justin Fields has a worse completion percentage over expected to start the year. Love's expected points added per dropback, that's looking good. But especially in a small sample, that can be driven by big plays. It can be skewed by big plays. His success rate, which measures the percentage of plays that are positive in expected points added, his success rate's below average. And then all the while, Green Bay has 7 total touchdowns on offense to start the year. 6 of those touchdowns against mediocre defenses have come through the air, which means only 1 has come on the ground. That's a ratio that's not going to be sustained throughout the season. It's rarely sustained. Now, the Packers do have a pretty favorable passing schedule for the rest of the year, so Love might be okay enough in fantasy. I'm not saying that he's going to just disappear and not be relevant. What I am saying is he's playing over his head right now, at least from a fantasy perspective. And I wanted to call that out. Add Matt Breida. So Saquon Barkley suffered an ankle injury in Sunday's win over the Cardinals, and that ailment's going to sideline him. Matt Breida is next in line for the Giants, or at least that's what we think. Truthfully, I think this is going to be a committee. Like more so than the average backfield. We could see Breida get the most work, maybe be that 1A in the offense, but Gary Brightwell and Eric Gray are there too. And it doesn't help that this week, the Giants get San Francisco. It's not a great matchup, although it is a revenge game for Matt Breida. We'll have to see how long Saquon Barkley is out at the time of this recording. I'm not totally sure, but I wouldn't go nuts adding Breida off the wire this week. Buy Josh Jacobs. Jacobs hasn't had the best start to his season. He's failed to score double-digit PPR points in both of his contests this year. He hit double-digit PPR points in 12 of 17 games last year. Now, if the Jacobs manager isn't doing that well, it could be time to pounce. Because even though the production hasn't been stellar, the usage has been. Only Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, and Christian McCaffrey have been able to hit an 80% running back rush share and a 15% target share through 2 games. And there's nothing scary at all about the Raiders' upcoming schedule. So you got to trust the volume, and I would trade for Josh Jacobs as a result. Add Tank Dell. So another player featured on the Sleeper Show this past week was rookie Tank Dell, and he delivered in week 2. Houston's been a lot more pass heavy to start the year than many expected. But that's going to happen when you run the most plays while trailing in the entire league. And they get the Jags next week too, so we shouldn't expect things to change. They're 9.5-point underdogs. Now, Nico Collins has been the stud in that offense so far this year, but Dell took advantage of that Noah Brown injury in week 2. He had a 23% target share. He ended up scoring over 20 PPR points. And here's the thing that I was most impressed by. Tank Dell is a 165-pound wide receiver. A lot of people thought that he would just simply play the slot in the NFL. In week 2, he only played 19% of his snaps from the slot. That's according to Next Gen Stats. So he did well on the outside. That's a big, big win. As I've been saying already this year, when a rookie has a strong performance, you don't want to be conservative with your approach on the waiver wire. So go ahead and get Tank Dell. Sell Gus Edwards. So without J.K. Dobbins in week 2, we got a glimpse of what this Ravens backfield is going to look like. And I'd say it was pretty predictable. Justice Hill and Gus Edwards predictably split that backfield. Edwards was the one who scored the touchdown, giving him the stronger day in fantasy. Now, the reason I'm not bullish on Edwards moving forward is because in a pretty nice script for Baltimore when they were leading by 10 points in the third quarter, Justice Hill still ended up out-snapping Edwards 38-32. And that's a big deal. Because if the Ravens hit a different script, if they're trailing in a game, we should probably expect Hill to be on the field then too. In week 2, Hill ran 18 routes to Edwards' 8. He saw 3 targets. Gus Edwards had 0. If the strong game scripts or the decent game scripts are still going to favor Justice Hill like we saw in week 2, then he's clearly the back that you want out of this backfield. Because when a negative game script hits, it's still going to be Justice Hill. And it's going to be more lopsided in Hill's favor more than likely. Buy Breece Hall. So we saw this Jets offense without Aaron Rodgers once again in week 2. And it was against the Cowboys, one of the toughest matchups you can find. As we all thought, the Jets offense, it wasn't very successful. And the run game in particular was absolute trash. The team's running backs had 10 carries for 24 yards. And unfortunately, they used 3 backs. They used Breece Hall, Dalvin Cook, and Michael Carter. Each of those players played a similar number of snaps. Breece Hall had 15, Dalvin Cook had 16, and Michael Carter had 15. So as a result of everything I just said, I totally understand if you want to skip this transaction. I understand if you don't want to go the direction of buying Breece Hall, because it's definitely a risky move. But I want talent on my fantasy rosters. That's why I'm recommending him right now. Because Breece Hall undeniably has that talent. We saw what he did against the Bills in week 1. And before getting injured in 2022, Breece Hall led all relevant running backs in yard after contact per attempt. The dude was trending last year to be an absolute stud in fantasy. Now, of course, the usage side of things, definitely scary here. A 3-headed monster in a bad offense, that's not what you want to buy into. But rational coaching says that this backfield snap share is not going to stay this way for the rest of the season. If the Jets really want to win football games, they need to use Breece Hall more, period. And Hall's going to get healthier, hopefully, as the season moves forward. He's the best back in this backfield. You look at him versus Dalvin Cook, not only with the eye test, but with metrics, there's a clear difference. There's already a sizable gap in success rate between the two. So I would buy low after week 2. Again, I understand there's a lot of risk in doing that. If you'd rather not take that on, totally understandable. There are some rosters where I'm not going to want to take it on. But I do think that there's a possibility that this is the cheapest that Breece Hall is going to be all year. Add Craig Reynolds. David Montgomery has what's being called a quad injury. It may take a couple of weeks for him to heal. That's going to give rookie Jahmyr Gibbs a big, big boost. But as we know, the Lions like to divvy up that backfield. And Gibbs doesn't profile to be a workhorse back. He's a receiving threat. Craig Reynolds is next in line to get some reps. He was the only other running back outside of Gibbs and Montgomery to see a snap on Sunday for Detroit, and he carried the ball 3 times for 7 yards. I don't think this is going to be a long-term thing, though. So don't go overspending on Reynolds. He's just a fine fill-in, though, for running back needy teams. And the Lions get the Falcons here in week 3. Add Josh Reynolds. Apparently, if your last name's Reynolds and you play for the Lions, you're going to be added off the waiver wire this week. Josh Reynolds finished week 1 with 7 more routes run than teammate Marvin Jones, and he had a 21.9% target share. In week 2 against Seattle, Reynolds ran 8 more routes than Marvin Jones, and he had 6 targets to Jones' 0. Reynolds is Detroit's number 2 wide receiver, as long as Jamison Williams is sidelined. And with a game against a beatable Falcons defense this weekend, Josh Reynolds might be able to find your starting lineup. Buy Jackson Smith and Jigba. So all these peripheral numbers that I'm citing each week on this show, they can be predictive. That's why I'm talking about them. But they're not always super static, especially with rookies. Like take Marvin Mims, for instance. Marvin Mims had this huge week 2 outing. He made some big plays. But his peripheral numbers were not nearly as good as you might think. He only ran 5 routes in that contest. At this time, that kind of route run number, that's not bankable week in and week out. But that doesn't mean that Marvin Mims should just be left alone. He's just not being featured today because I already talked about him before week 1. But I'm bringing him up because the exact same thing to a lesser degree can be said about Jackson Smith-Njigba. JSN's peripheral numbers are not amazing. He played just 54% of Seattle's snaps in week 2. Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf were over 82%. But even with that limitation, Smith-Njigba has 11 targets on the year. Tyler Lockett has 14, and DK Metcalf also has 11. Now, we may not see JSN pass up DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett on the depth chart this year. That might not happen. It's in his range of outcomes, but it's not a lock. This is not a situation like Jordan Addison versus KJ Osborne, where Osborne's playing ahead of Addison right now, but that's almost definitely not going to maintain. This could actually maintain. But the thing that gets lost in these discussions is contingent upside. Smith-Njigba has standalone value right now. Like I said, he's seen 11 targets through 2 games, but he has plenty of outs. Not only can he just outplay expectation, but he can also see an uptick in work if there's an injury to Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. Not many talented wide receivers in the NFL are positioned like this, where there's not just one injury out, but there's 2 of them. So because he does have that usable floor right now, because he is usable in some way, I would love to have that floor-ceiling combo on my roster. And right now, you can still buy him low. Add Jerome Ford. Nick Chubb hurt his knee in a really gruesome way on Monday night, and that led to a big workload for Jerome Ford. He ended up running the ball 16 times for over 100 yards. Now, we should assume that the Browns are going to go out this week and get another running back. But there aren't many options out there that are better than Ford. Unless they do something like trade for Cam Akers, which is always possible. But that does make me feel like Ford will at least be the top player in this backfield moving forward. And he showed up on Monday night. He had a reasonable 44% success rate. Now, I wouldn't bet on Ford being a full-blown bell cow in that offense. He's not going to carry Nick Chubb's workload, but he should have plenty of fantasy value moving forward. Add Tony Jones and Kendre Miller. Jamal Williams was also hurt on Monday night, but fortunately, his injury wasn't as bad as Nick Chubb's. But he still didn't get a lot of playing time. Instead, it was Tony Jones, the team's 4th-string running back, who ended up with a Jerome Bettis-like line, carrying the ball 12 times for 34 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, at the time of this recording, there's not enough information for me to know whether or not Jamal Williams is going to go next week. If he doesn't go, Jones could see double-digit touches once again. But also, don't forget about rookie Kendre Miller. He's been sidelined, but he could suit up next week after dealing with his hamstring issue. This is just one of those situations where you have to keep up with the news. Sell James Conner. So as long as James Conner's healthy, the usage is probably going to be there. But that's obviously a question mark. He's never played a full 16 or 17 game season in the NFL. His usage in week 1 and week 2, though, has been strong. He's seen 82% of Arizona's running back rushes and a 10.2% target share. And according to Fantasy Life's awesome utilization report, Conner's played all of Arizona's 2-minute snaps. Basically what I'm saying here, he's an every down back for the Cardinals. And I think that he's destined to be a solid contributor for your fantasy team as long as he can stay off the injury report. Do I think he's going to be a league-winning player? No. Do I think he can be solid? Yes. The reason I'm calling him out this week, though, as a sell is because Arizona gets Dallas and San Francisco over their next 2 games. Maybe you're sitting there with James Conner and your team's 0-2 and you need a change. Maybe you're desperate for a win. Now might be the time to trade him away for a higher variance asset. Because chances are you're not going to get amazing production from him against 2 of the top defenses in the league over the next 2 weeks. Add the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. The Jags actually did an okay job at stopping the Chiefs in week 2. And their job's going to be a lot easier this week against the Texans. The game's in Jacksonville, and the Jags are 9.5-point favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook. Houston's now allowed opposing fantasy defenses to rank in the top 10 in each of the first 2 weeks of the season. And they've allowed a top 5 pressure rate. So the Jags are an easy streamer for me this week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.